And I will kick things off with it's very good to see you this morning. We've got a full house. I'm so excited for you to join us today for episode number 48 of Business Unusual, Prospecting Through Uncertainty. And we started this webinar series at about the same time last year. And our entire emphasis was on helping business professionals pivot their sales and marketing effort based on all of the changes that are happening during the pandemic. And we have so many compelling issues that we're all struggling with right now. And our topics every week, we want to give you a highlight of what someone is doing that has pivoted, or we're giving you insight into how to conduct your own pivot and be effective with whatever approach you're currently using in your sales and marketing. So with that, I was very excited today to welcome Mike Bailey, who has been my coach. And I would like to just share a little bit of how I have known Mike over the years so that you understand how high a regard I hold him in. He is so talented at what he does in helping professionals recognize what they should be doing in order to present their brand as professionally during speaking engagements, virtual presentations, sales pitches, you name it. That's Mike's area of expertise. And when I first started working with Mike, I had never given a presentation before in my life. And I stood up at one of my very first networking group presentations that I had been asked to do. And I felt as if I was pretty much falling on my face. And I knew I was not connecting with my audience as I should have. I had always been comfortable and confident in a one-to-one sales environment, but I certainly did not understand the nuances that were different in talking one-to-many and having my message heard and received and have it also stick the way that I wanted it to. So I engaged Mike, and it was pretty fun because it took me a few more of stumble and fall before I finally said, I've got to get help and practice what I teach. And as a coach, it's kind of bad if you don't look for coaching for yourself. So I reached out, and Mike dove in and was absolutely phenomenal in helping me figure out that whole getting things underway. And I have continued to work with him over the years, because I don't care how often you've done this, especially now, it always helps to have a tune-up. And he's an amazing resource, and I'm excited to have him share some of his best tune-up tips with us today. So Mike, do you want to do a real quick introduction, and then we'll dive in with our questions?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being online. It's a fascinating world, live communication. And what we're doing is we're doing it virtually at the moment, and it's quite different to the real live environment where you've got a group of people in front of you. And we're going to look at some of the issues that people have with just communicating live. George Bernard Shaw said, the biggest problem with communication today is the illusion that it's actually taken place.
That's certainly true.
It is very true. You see, unless we understand the process, when you said, Brenda, when you first started doing this, you sort of knew that you weren't connecting how you wanted to connect, but you didn't know how to do it. And that's the point. If you look at, and if you remember that first day you jumped in a car to drive it, how fast did you go? Maybe 15 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour. You're still in first gear. Oh, it was a stick shift, was it? And you have no idea what to do. Well. Yeah, but God only gave me two legs and 2 feet.
And
so how do we do
it? That's fun.
Anyway.
Well, Mike, I'm so glad to have you with us today. I am going to go ahead and kill my webcam so that I don't drain bandwidth. I'm going to leave you live, though, and I do have a lot of questions that There were several that came in this morning for, we had talked, it was funny, Mike and I prepared a little bit earlier in the week, and we talked through what we most wanted to cover this morning during our presentation. And it seems as if a lot of the folks that we're working with right now are doing virtual presentations, and they're struggling because of a lot of different factors. So what I would like to do first is have Mike kind of help us with a little bit of the mindset for preparing and making the most of virtual presentations. So Mike, how would you recommend someone get comfortable, first of all, with the being on camera and getting to where they're actually willing to hit that go live button? How can you help us with that?
Like any talk, you have to prepare. And unless you have prepared adequately, you can't think of everything, but you do need to prepare. You need to prepare yourself first, very important. When does a sprinter start sprinting? No, it's not when they're in the chocks and the gun goes off. It's a long time before that. And it's just the same with any presentation, whether it's a virtual, what we're doing now, or whether it's live in person. There has to be a time of preparation. And you have to know what it is that you've got to prepare. You've got to prepare the technology. Don't just assume that 2 minutes before you're due on, you're going to switch on. No, you've got to get everything set up right. Is the microphone working? Is the camera working? Is the lighting correct? So many times when I see people on Zoom or GoToWebinar or any of the other formats that we have these days, they don't think about any of that. And it can be a distraction. And this is the thing, we have to get rid of distractions, whether that's visual, whether it's audible, whatever that is. Is the cat or the dog going to walk in while you're doing this? Or your kid or somebody else? Again, it's all part of the preparation. Preparing yourself. How do you prepare yourself? Well, one of the things you have to do is to, wait for it, breathe deeply. Well, I'm breathing, Mike. Yeah, but are you breathing the right way? Are you breathing sufficiently that you can get a sound out of your mouth that people will hear and understand? So often, the words that come out of our mouths are not enunciated clearly enough. And with digital communications, which is what we're using today, there is so much conversion of the real sound into digital ones and zeros. And it happens so many times. I was doing a calculation. If you've got a headset on, it's actually being digitized about 6 times. Well, by the time that comes out at the other end, it can be pretty distorted.
And this is, we see evidence of this with that, the meme, or I think it was a recording that was actually sparking fights on social media, where there was a recording of someone saying Laurel, but they had also, over the recording, it was Yanny. And depending on which frequency you heard, depended on what you heard. So that's an example of how things, I think, shift. So it's certainly true. So, okay, Mike, I've got a question for you then. So let's say I'm getting ready to hit that go live button for the very first time. And I'm sitting here and I've got sweaty palms and I've got that feeling that is, you know, that nervous knot that you get in your stomach that makes you not quite sure if you're going to be able to actually even talk. You have helped me so much with overcoming stage fright and those nerves. Give us some ideas of what we can do about overcoming that prior to our virtual presentations.
Yet it comes back to what I was just saying, preparation. Unless you are prepared, those things will happen. It's something that I call heightened awareness. Just think about driving at a very fast speed. And when I say very fast, I mean greater than 65, 70 miles an hour, maybe 100 miles an hour, maybe 120 miles an hour, maybe 150 miles an hour. Yes, I have. When you are in that environment, the only thing you can be thinking about and concentrating on is what's going on around you. It's just the same in the live communication environment. The issue that we have, like today with GoWebinar, I can't see any of you. So I have no idea. I'm getting no feedback at all as to what you're feeling, what you're thinking, are you concentrating? Whereas in the full live environment where you've got people in front of you, you can see those things. You get that feedback. You can read their body language. Deep breathing, really deep breathing. And I do a little training in my training. I start off with what I call a 2-2-4. I breathe in for 2 seconds, I hold for 2 seconds, I breathe out for 4 seconds. I then go to a 4-4-8, and then finally an 8-8-16. I breathe in for 8, I hold it for 8, and that holding is a very important part of it. The reason is you are oxygenating your blood to a much higher level. It's rather like a workout without actually having to do it. It's great.
I love any of those tips that I can use my workout, get that workout feeling in without actually having to go to a gym. I think many of us are dealing with that today. How
Indeed.
how would you recommend when you talk about that enunciation, it's very hard to understand just how we are heard. In our heads we hear ourselves, but what are some tips that you have for us on maximizing the vocal part of it? Because so many of us are either doing podcasts or conference calls. Everything is shifted. So what are some tips that you have for us on that vocalization?
Record yourself, whether that's just the audio or the visual as well. Record yourself and play it back. Yeah, it can sound a bit strange because you're hearing yourself as your audience hears you, not as you hear yourself through your ear here and through your head, the vibration in your bones. It's very important to understand what your audience is hearing. And when sound leaves your mouth, you have to create that sound. And when it leaves your mouth, many things happen to it. If you're in a room, the sound bounces against walls, the floor, the ceiling, and depending on that material, whether there's any reflection from it. And when you then have a number of different sound waves hitting together, they get all confused and muddled up. But that's what your audience is hearing. That's why you have to enunciate. You have to send that sound out as clearly as you can. Let me give you an example. How do you pronounce? I can show you this bottle here, which contains a liquid, which is a very clear liquid, which I get out of the tap. How do you pronounce what that liquid is? Most Americans will say water. But if that sound is with a sentence, what a crazy thing we're doing. It's not the liquid water, it's what a. And we have to be so careful that we enunciate clearly so that the audience at least has a chance of understanding what we're trying to say, let alone the words that we're using. And let me come to that point. Every industry has its own language. You've got to be very careful not to speak your language. You've got to speak your audience's language. Otherwise, they're not going to understand you. Over to you, Brendan.
Oh my goodness. I'm just sitting here feeling all of the buzzwords and acronyms that I have had to remove from my vocabulary over the years based on your recommendations and feedback. So what do you think if we think about, and this was actually one of the questions that came across when I sent the email reminder last night and asked what the audience would most like to learn about doing virtual presentations.
Mhm.
When we have had this shift of going from standard communication, what we're used to, of where you stand in front of someone or you're having a conversation, we know that that message is divided into three parts. It's based on the words, it's based on our tone of voice, and our body language, right?
Yes.
So then if before COVID, all this stuff happened, it used to be a mix of, what was it? It was less than 10% were the actual words spoken. And
It's
then,
it's closer to 5%.
right, so it's a very small percentage was the words that were said. And then there was a little bit over 30%, I think it was, that was your tone of voice, and then 55% was body language.
Correct. And in
So,
fact, I've rounded those numbers to make it easier. 5% of the words, 35%, that's 7 times. 7 times the words is how you say them. It makes such a difference. It can completely change the meaning as well. Again, we come back to, you know what you're, or at least you think you know what you're saying and how you're saying it, but what is your audience hearing? A presentation is never, sorry guys, it's never about you. Oh, please, of course it's about me. No, it's not. It's about your audience. Unless you are serving your audience and speaking their language, you're not going to engage with them.
and one thing that you're doing, Mike, that I would really like to point out to everyone is, okay, you're right now, are you standing or are you sitting to do your
I'm,
presentation?
I'm sitting.
Okay,
Yes, I
but
prefer to stand, but you see, with the virtual, with a camera, which is showing a pretty limited area, if I do a lot of movement, which you might be doing in a real live environment, you've got about 3 seconds where they're going to clock out. You can't do that because you are so, it's like being right in front of someone's face. You can't be doing all the things that you would do where the audience is 20, 50, 100 feet away. You've got to consider this movement and what the audience is seeing and feeling.
and the other thing that you're also doing, in spite of the fact that we can't see all of you, I still see you using a lot of facial expression. I see you using a lot of your hands during this. Talk about why you do that in a virtual presentation.
Okay, let me go back to the live environment in front of a real live audience and why you do this. Because so much of the communication comes from here, from your face, the sound, the eyes, the smile. Hey, try smiling.
I heard that.
Very important. And guess what? It's real difficult to do because you're trying to think of everything else that's going on. But what gestures do and what facial expressions do is to magnify the message that you are giving. You've got to be careful in the live environment how much of this you're doing. And if you're very used to doing this, and some people are, again, it can be so confusing and this really important thing, distracting. You want your message to come through clearly, defined, concise, and you don't want all the distractions, which include your background, lighting. Consider lighting. Normally, I've got, and you might be able to see them up in the ceiling, there's one there and there's another one over there, and there's track lighting all around this room. But I've turned them off for this because I only want the front lighting. Otherwise, if you've got bright light on your background, it's a distraction. And think about the background. Do you have something that is large and is similar size to what the audience is seeing, your head, your face, your shoulders and everything? If it's that sort of size, it might seem rather nice and attractive. It's horribly distracting.
That's great insight. So now let's talk just a little bit, because I think you've shared something here that is a key point that I'd love for folks to recognize. You take that same idea about using your body language and inflection, you still focus on that even though you're in a virtual environment. While you're not, you're moving enough so that you're still natural. And I remember when I did my first presentations, when I finished the webinar, I actually felt tight through my shoulders and my neck because I had had so much stress during that presentation that nowadays it's like I'll even during the presentation, whenever I have a few moments, I'll roll my shoulders, or I'll make sure that I sit up and I look up. And that's very hard because right now we're looking down at a computer screen, even for our presentation today. But I think the more you can actually have even a standing desk or be up so that the screen is higher and it's more at chest level instead of at about below your sternum, I think that helps also. So, I mean, those are just some things that I know I've picked up from you as far as your advice and guidance. So that whole 50% or so that's still body language, it's like right now, even though I'm not on camera, I'm still using a lot of hand gestures to emphasize my points because that is coming through. So how do you help people, or how should people think through in their statements? What do they need to have that inflection on so that they're still communicating effectively, even if it's audio and they're not direct to camera?
Well, because the visual is about 60% of the communication, then you've got to look at what area is the camera capturing, and you have to use that. So the biggest thing that you've got is your face. Be very careful about the hand gestures because, as I showed you earlier, doing things like this, no, you can't do it in the virtual environment because of that distraction. So your face, your expressions on your face, your voice, how important is your voice in this virtual environment? It is so important. If you have a very, very slight movement of your voice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, they're going to be asleep.
Oh my goodness.
What is the attention span? Okay, all you people with kids, what's the attention span of a child?
Oh my goodness. I think about 3 seconds, if that.
It's pretty close, and of course it depends on what they're talking about and doing, but it's around the 5 seconds. So what's the attention span of an adult?
Is it less?
That is often a common answer, but it's about 7 seconds. It's not much different. And you can so easily lose people's attention because you haven't engaged them. If you don't engage their mind, you're going to lose them very quickly. So how do you engage in this environment? You have to ask questions. You can't be all tell. You're trying to throw and stuff this pie down their throat. They're not going to enjoy it. No, we've got to find the little slice that audience needs, not what you need. And you have to deliver it in a way that's exciting, changing how you enunciate, that sing-song in your voice. That's what brings interest to the voice that you have. Until you've practiced that, it's very difficult to do. I remember when I went through training. I thought, there's no way I'm going to do that. Hey, I trained as an engineer. I'm an engineer. Engineers don't talk, and certainly don't talk to people. Good heavens, we work with things, not people. And it was quite a strange thing for me to do.
Oh my goodness. I remember just whenever you're learning new skills and that whole practice and refining the approach, it's certainly something that you do have to recognize that it is a journey, and it's not a fast or easy journey. It's definitely not the trip to the grocery store. It's more like, I think, the cross country trip is how I have found it. And especially over this past year, where we have gone to what used to have been 2 to 3 of these meetings a week that I did because I had clients all over the country, to now every single meeting is happening that way. And just that it's an immersion, and you put yourself into that situation. And I found it so beneficial to make it a goal of having at least 2 to 4 meetings per day, and focusing on being as effective and comfortable on camera as I can be. And then it's fun to actually record the presentation and go back and look at everything that you do and then refine your approach. That's one of the other challenges, or one of the other, I shouldn't call it a challenge, I should call it an opportunity. So much of what we're doing now is being recorded. So now, with that being said, so if we are focusing on, we're wanting to do video, like this presentation that we're doing today is going to be repurposed and it's going to go to YouTube. And we recognize that social media right now is really emphasizing and rewarding people that are using video in their presentations. What are some of the tips that you have for us on preparing that, making them, well, instead of the tips, we've talked about that. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see people make when they're going live on camera?
Very important to look at your camera result before you actually go online. And depending on what program you're using, you can do that. I use Windows, and it's very easy. I just go to the camera and I can check everything out beforehand. If you can possibly, please don't use a cell phone. Why? Try holding it still. You can't. You cannot use it still. You've got to use some form of holding it still. A tripod or something like that. It's got to be held still, because otherwise you're going to be like this in their picture, and it's going to be a distraction. I keep coming back to this word, because if you don't remove the distractions, it's not your message that they're going to hear. It's all the distractions. Another thing you've got to be very careful about: verbalized pauses. What do I mean by that? You see, that piece of silence, when you're speaking and you're not used to doing this, can be very uncomfortable. But the pause, when used correctly, with the correct timing, is way more powerful than trying to fill it with any sound. So no, I don't know. Don't tell me I know. But so many people, they preface what they're going to say with, or they've just said something, or it's like. How do you know I like? How do you
Or
know?
my personal favorite, so. That's the word that you always catch me with.
Well, and I do that as well. But
We have verbal tics.
yes, it's not so intrusive. And again, occasionally you've got to use it because it is a link into the next thing that you're saying. You're preparing them for that. Rather like a movie. If you're going to move from one scene to another, if you're making a movie and you've got to move from one scene to another, you've got to consider your audience and lead them on that journey from point A to point B with what's called a linking shot, so that they're not confused that we're in a totally different environment. It's just the same when you're speaking. If you're going to change subject, you know where you're at. Your brain is hopefully thinking and controlling where you're going to. But if you're going to change slightly what you're talking about, you've got to lead the audience to that new place. Otherwise, they're still back where you were and they won't understand the context in what you're talking about. So these verbalized pauses, be very, very careful. That's a sign of nervousness. I don't care you're nervous. You've got to hide that. And if you want to know how, I can show you.
And I remember the count, I think, of ums when I did my first presentation and you graded me on it. I remember in a 10-minute presentation, I think it was over 40.
Well, that's okay. It sounds bad, but that's only about what, 4 a minute? When the worst one I ever saw was 35 in 1 minute. That's more than one every 2 seconds. It's absolutely crazy. And what do you remember? You remember all the ums and not the message.
And you remember that they were nervous and awkward and not as confident in their subject. At least that was the perception that you have. And that's the thing, I really want to emphasize that for our group today. The reason why I invited you is because so many of us are winging it as we're trying to navigate through learning how to work in these virtual environments. And it is something that I think a lot of us have struggled with. And actually, I think it would be fun to do just a quick poll of our audience. How many of you, and if you would please go ahead and chime in via the questions pane and let me know how many of you are doing virtual presentations more to groups now than you were prior to the pandemic, and how many of you are still just presenting one-to-one. So just let me know in the message, are you one-to-one or one-to-many? And we'll take just a second and see where everybody's at. Let's make sure our audience is still awake. Okay, I've got lots that are in the doing one-to-one. And then, oh, okay, now I've got some that are just really diving in to the one-to-many. Now, Colleen, I know that you're going to be a rock star at this because she's used to presenting in front of very large groups. So we've got a lot of, you got a lot of variety here, Mike.
Excellent. But that shows what the population is like. We are all individuals. We as the presenter and our audience. And we have to be cognizant of that. Let me just come back to one thing. Live communication is not a talent. You're not born with the ability to do that. It's a skill. And how are skills learned? They're learned by observing, by reading, by practicing. Oh, I've got to practice. Yeah, sorry. Yes, you need to practice. Do it in front of the mirror or do it in front of your camera, record it, and be very analytical as to what is going on. If you're not sure what's going on, then make sure that you stay on to the end of this because I've got a little gift for you.
Oh, fantastic. I love it. I love your gifts. Now, the other question that came across, because I had a few responses to the email that I had sent out, is when you're doing a Zoom presentation, you're supposed to make eye contact as much as possible. So that means look at the camera. But if you're also in a position where you can see the other folks that are participating in the conversation, because of, Zoom gives you that functionality of you can actually see their side of it as well. How do you do both, where you're trying to actually look at the audience, but it's down on the bottom of the screen or to the right, and the camera is in the top middle?
Thank you, Jeff Palacio, for your question. I met Jeff a couple of weeks ago. Great guy. If you want to meet somebody who can inspire you, go meet Jeff. Okay. Can you see my eyes moving? Can anybody see my eyes moving?
Yes.
But it's a very small part because they're not in full brightness. They're tiny compared with the whole size of the screen at the moment. And if you don't move your head, then people are rarely, I would say 90% of people are not going to notice. So don't worry too much about that. Yes, I'm glancing down. When I was preparing this, you can see that, right? I use these little yellow stickies. Just an idea comes up, bang, how do I capture that? A key word or just 2 or 3 words, put it on a little sticky, put it on there. Then you can organize it into a much more cohesive and coherent type of discussion. And if you can then write that out clearly enough, I can glance at mine right now, and you probably have no idea that I've been glancing at it.
So how far away from the camera should you be when you're presenting? That was another question that just came in from Mike.
I'm about 20 inches at the moment.
And what is that based on?
A ruler?
Well, is that a rule of thumb that you're going to do with any camera or any presentation you do? Is there ever a time, for instance, I'm probably 2 feet away from the camera because otherwise I'm all face in my screen.
That's right, and that's important. If you're going to do all face, it's going to be very difficult for you, and people aren't going to be too happy with you doing it that way.
It's a little awkward.
Extremely awkward, yes. But you have to demonstrate these things. Whereas how you're doing it, Brendan, and how I'm doing it, I'm only about 25, 30% of the screen, which is comfortable. So your movements, your slight movements, are not going to be overpowering, which they would be if you were right up close to the camera. So you've got to sense that distance. I know you best practices, rule of thumb. There's no such thing in my book as a best practice or a rule of thumb. It comes with a lot of experience, and that's what a skill is. A skill is a combination of a lot of experiences. How do you get to that point? If you don't know all the things that are going on, you have no means of controlling it. It's just like driving a car at a fast speed. That heightened awareness of being aware of everything that's going on. What do you look like? If I can suggest, and gals, I know it's difficult, be careful about the amount of jewelry that you're wearing, because you're so much closer to the camera, which is where your audience is. It's not like being live in front of a group of people where you're perhaps 30, 40, 50 feet away. It becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller the further you go away. even though the actual size of that object isn't changing, the perceived size is. So be careful about wearing jewelry. It can be a distraction, and you want to remove all of these distractions.
And it doesn't necessarily work to duct tape your child and lock them in the closet to eliminate the virtual, the distraction of homeschooling children and everything else. And that's just inquiring minds want to know. That was actually, it was funny. One of our very first BU presentations that we did was on how to navigate doing virtual presentations while homeschooling children and dealing with spouses that are playing through the middle of your screen wearing a towel because they just got dressed as they were. That's the thing I think that we should all remember is we are all on this journey together, and the more real you can be, and it's one of those cases, it used to be all about faking it till you make it, and now I just think you have to laugh. And I do, it's very humorous. I do make sure that I am dressed all the way down to my toes, even though you're only going to see the top half. I have several of my clients that laugh because they'll wear the suit from the waist up and then be wearing their sweatpants or yoga pants on the bottom. And I have found it very helpful if you actually do get dressed as if you're going to show up for a meeting.
Yes.
So you are there and you are on it.
Today is the first day in about 12 months I've worn a shirt. I did it especially for you. I wore a shirt. It feels most strange, but I thought, yeah, it's probably more appropriate than what I have been wearing. I like to wear comfortable. I don't own a suit anymore. For so many years, I wore suits. Ugh. But yes,
you
as
made
you
a good point. You're comfortable, but yet you're very professional.
correct, and that is so important. And what you said just now, in terms of something that happens that you weren't expecting, like your child runs in or whatever, when Brendan and I were talking earlier this week in how are we going to do this? Brendan kept talking to her daughter. Stop drawing, get on with your work. But it was an opportunity where we could actually discuss what was going on and how to read what was going on. And I said to Brendan, Brendan, you're getting very important messages from your daughter, which maybe you're not recognizing. And it can be just the same with your audience. With a one-on-one, it's much more easier to do than when you're doing a Zoom call with 50 people on and you've got two screens with 25 on each screen. You've got to be aware of your audience and help them.
And it is hard to recognize when you're in an environment, especially like this. GoToWebinar does not allow the functionality of looking at your audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a bit of a challenge. And that's something that I would like to actually talk just a little bit about your chosen platform and your topic.
Mm-hmm.
We have opted to do the GoToWebinar because we're taking our recordings and going over to YouTube with them. And Jeff, I have to make sure you're okay with us actually sharing our YouTube since we did mention your name on this. But we actually chose to go with this platform so that we did not have to have individual releases from every participant that is on the call with us. And while YouTube so far, we only have 30 subscribers, we at some point hope to have a lot more. And we recognize that that could go out to a lot of different people. And I know Zoom is a better platform because it does allow that functionality of you being able to see your audience as well. What are some other platforms that are out there, and what are your tips, Mike, on which ones should we embrace and which ones have been difficult to work with?
Good question. Thank you, Brendan. I only have experience of Zoom, the Google one, which I can't remember what it's called, and GoToWebinar. If you are doing just talking, then I prefer Zoom, because then you do have that ability of seeing so many people. But if you're doing slides as well, and that's another big issue, how do you do slides? And I'm a bit picky about slides. Zoom is not so easy to do that, because it reduces it down to just maybe two, the person who's leading, the person who's talking, and your slide. And in webinar, it's just the person who's talking and your slide. So again, think about, who's my audience? What message am I trying to give them? What is the best environment for doing that in? Is it Zoom? Is it GoToWebinar? Is it Google? And I know there's some others as well. So it's all part of that planning. Oops, I keep saying so, don't I? but that's the point, you see. I'm catching myself doing that. And that's part of how you stop doing it. When you can hear yourself doing it, no, you don't, then you will stop it.
And it is funny how you do catch yourself with, as soon as someone brings it to your attention, then all of a sudden your subconscious actually works as an accountability. There's a snap, a mental snap that takes place, where it used to be the rubber band you'd put on your wrist that you'd snap yourself with. I will catch myself all the time. And I'm so hyper aware of it. I knew I would be even more so after talking with you today. Now, okay, there's another question. If you were presenting in front of a group, what is the ideal number to have in one of these conversations or presentations that you're doing? Or is there an ideal number, since we now have the opportunity to serve potentially hundreds or thousands with these calls and the platforms?
If you've got a very large number, then certainly GoToWebinar certainly seems to be a very good environment in which to do it, because you're, as the speaker, not being distracted by all the people that are there, who are there instantaneously. Whereas if you were doing it actually live in person in front of that group, you will get a feel of the whole group, but you haven't got all those people all at the same distance away from you, which is what the virtual environment does. Again, it comes back to that: what's my purpose? What's my message? Who is my audience? What am I trying to achieve? And I'm just looking at some of the points that I've made here. Yes. A presentation is not a monologue. It's a conversation, which is, or should be, a dialogue. How do you engage your audience's mind? By asking questions. Not the, did you have a good journey here this morning? Okay, so I've got 30 steps to walk down to get to my basement. No.
That was a long commute.
It was a huge commute. That's my exercise for the day. Come on.
But no traffic. Woohoo!
Yeah, well, I don't know. There's the cat and there's my daughter. And the cat loves to trip me up. Sorry. I'm going down it's a conversation. You've got to ask open-ended questions. The what, where, when, why, who type questions. Because then you can't answer yes or no to it. You've got to engage the mind. They're going to be thinking. And when they're thinking, they are being engaged in your conversation.
And that is something that I think many of us struggle with when you are doing a virtual presentation, because I remember when you showed me the notes section on PowerPoint. And that was something that totally blew my mind. I think you did it 15 years ago, something like that. You showed me the functionality. And at that point, I started using that feature
to script my talking points so that I would be very focused and targeted with my message. And now you're doing things a little bit differently. You've got your sticky notes that you're doing. So what is on your sticky notes, and how do you recommend we prepare for presentations like today that you do want to engage the audience, even though my group is large? We've got over 50 people here.
Excellent. Let me put that. Okay. Can you read that word? Is it the right way round? Script, right? Just a single word. Because the words that you say are all going to be around that word in the sentence to convey a meaning and context in which that word is used. But your audience will not use the same words that you do. It's only the key word. We're talking about a script. They will put their own words around that in their mind in order to convey their understanding of what you are trying to communicate. And the point about that particular word, what I want to say about script, don't ever read a script. It is the worst thing you can do because you're not going to be you. You've got to be you. You've got to be seen as authentic, as genuine, the real you. And I tell my clients, I'm going to get the real you out of you. You've been so squashed and boxed in by life, by experiences, that real you, getting you out, is going to release you, and you are going to feel amazed.
And it is so much more fun when you are doing presentations like that, and it's so funny. I remember when we were preparing for this today, you were emphatic on, we're going to go where the audience takes us, and based on questions and based on the conversation that's here, as opposed to having a set of questions, as in a structured set of questions that we're rigid with. And that, I think, is something that many of us, and I've learned through this experience when we first started doing this series. In the very beginning, our presentations were almost painful when we go back and look at them now. And I'm leaving them live, and I encourage everyone to go look at them now and look at where Chris and I were when we started, and then look at how we have evolved. And I can't stress enough how powerful being able to engage with all of you and serve you, this has been life-changing for me since we started doing this. And we started doing this because we wanted to help other people. And what we have found is that through what we have learned from people like Mike and our other speakers, and the opportunity to engage has been so much more rewarding than any business benefits that we would have received just in terms of our own learning. But when we first started, we did everything that was very structured and even scripted on the notes section to make sure we had our talking points. And then we are evolving now to where we're doing more interview, where the person we're interviewing is direct to camera. So you have the opportunity to have more of a conversation with someone and feel like it's a conversation instead of a set presentation. So what I would love for everybody to think about is, what are some of your biggest questions that you have, or what are the obstacles that you're creating in your own mind that are stopping you from jumping into the opportunities that are present with doing virtual presentations?